a project in southwest Scotland where there were a lot of industrial camps at the time, people who were building factories, producing airfields, putting up buildings for the RAF, mending aircraft. I sat with them in the canteen eating and listened to what they were talking about. And to my surprise, they were talking almost exclusively about income tax. So I nudged one of them and said, would you like me to get hold of somebody who knows about taxation? And he said, would you? They were terribly pleased about this. And somebody came up and said, it's the first time anybody's ever asked us what we want.
The big concept of wartime was the nationalisation of the pits and the steelworks. This was the kind of thing that you were discussing in adult education, was nationalisation. We were living in Coatbridge and Airdrie in the centre of coal and steel production. And in the historical centre of coal and steel production in Scotland, we were talking about the central economic factor in Scottish life. What else could we be talking about in our classes?
Classes in international relations were very high standard and would be used in universities at the same time. But the people who were coming to these classes, maybe 10 to 20 of them, were devoted to it. That was what they spent the week at, and came the next week and they contributed and they knew what they were going to do. So it wasn't really a leisure class, and it wasn't a university class. It was between the two. People were interested, but they didn't want necessarily to get degrees or sit diplomas or anything like that.
The co-ops were in some kind of crisis, or at least they were looking to reorganisation. This is not just Scotland, the whole of the UK. They commissioned a report called the Independent Commission, decided that the WEA would be a proper body to promote discussion on the report. It was board members, employees, the women's guilds, which is absolutely fascinating. Some of it on day release for employees. I mean, it was real adult education in the sense that you were talking very much to people about their lives, their involvement, their own co-op society, talking about economics. The hopes were also that a new perspective would be put onto the whole notion of adult education, and I don't doubt that Ken Alexander did that actually.
It's a fine enough piece of work if only it had been implemented. It wasn't implemented because it was never resourced.
Blazing inflation, terrible problems of the economy, changes of government within 2 or 3 years.
So the vision was there, but up against an institutional framework that basically didn't shift.
It meant that we did not have control of our own resources. So although we were running huge numbers of classes, the money was all tied up in the local authority. Just, I suppose, the major disappointment of Alexander that we weren't allowed to become providers in our own right.
And I decided that this new unemployed work would be aimed at people with no or few qualifications. We're not going to assume we know what they want to learn. We're going to interview them in depth and find out. And I managed to assemble 31 people. And I then got 4 or 5 interviewers. The underlying idea was to ask them about their lives. And there was to be 2 aspects. One was facts, job history in great detail, education history in detail, relationship history in detail, and then what were they actually interested in studying. And that showed clearly what their life experiences were, what they were interested in studying, and we based the programme on that. And I organised it into 4 chunks. They're interested in human relationships, they're interested in politics and society, They're interested in writing and reading, and they're interested in arithmetic and maths.
It was a feature of what we did at the time. You did feel that you were part of a national organisation, and that it was about sharing and learning from other people's experiences. And there was an awful lot of that in the WEA. We tried to pioneer things and we tried to do new things, and whenever we did, we always wrote it up and shared it with other people.
It was about encouraging women to become everything they could be, not just to learn about women as an academic subject choice. And by setting up creches, we were able to go and reach what we saw as this very important target group of working class women in communities with young children.
In Grampian, we and the local authority were joint partners in the Grampian Adult Literacy Scheme, developing what we call basic education courses that had as one dimension the development of basic skills and study skills, but had a content and thematic matter that related to women's lives. Seemed like a good idea, and it was really popular. And we soon had a big programme, we called them Carry On Learning courses, all over the city and outside in the rural areas. And then we also developed a pack of resource materials.
The whole class was built around what this group of women felt and had experienced, and to me it was a very, very new way of exploring anything.
There was a real connection to peace movements, to women's movements, to anti-racist movements, and because a lot of the people were common to the movement and to the educational movement, if you like, there was a bringing into the classroom ways of acting, ways of working, which had belonged to that movement, and when married to educational ideas could be really creative.
So the idea of having social and political education became much more difficult. So the way I tried to keep that alive was to try and foster people's interest in their own lives in the community that they were in, which was a poor community obviously, and to find ways of telling that story one way or another, whether it was the history of it or the experience of living in it at the moment, but one way or another to tell that story.
You know, I left school at 15, I had no qualification. In fact, I was hardly there, and I hated it, and I hated the man of the teachers. I've never praised for anything. I mean, I was never ever told I was a good writer, which obviously is a matter of opinion, but I did, have quite a lot of things published later on. And I've been one person since then. Whenever we went to Come Always, Writers Come Always in Edinburgh, and it was all the writers for Scotland, and you get hints from them, and you get reading your own stuff, and magical experiences.
Before the publication of the book, we had to raise funds personally ourselves as a group, and we had to go round with a begging bowl. So the WEA taught us how to do that as well.
Not taught us how to beg, to negotiate.
The Learning for Action pack, a student pack and a tutor pack. So when that pack was published, it was all materials that had been used and had been proved commented on, A, by the training group, but also by the people who were participating in the classes.
We established an ongoing partnership with the WEA, principally around community group training and community representative training programme, but also very strong links into the arts with writers groups and support to community radio station, drama work. We really flew in Drumchapel actually.
In 1989-90, with Bob Turner, my colleague in Renfrew district, we piloted the NUPE Return to Learn course for their own members. In this respect, here we were returning to genuine member education instead of the representative type training that we've been doing under the TUC education scheme. The Return to Learn pilot with NUPE worked very well indeed, and once Unison was formed in 1995, it took off into a large programme, not only for their own members but for public sector workers within the NHS and in local government, and we've had big schemes since the end of the 90s. It's a major achievement for the WEA in this regard.
I think it's an interesting mismatch. All the main ideas that the Scottish Executive has for education, particularly adult education, is work that the WEA has done or could do, and yet they don't immediately see the WEA as the provider. And there is still the amazing gap between what is needed and what is provided in terms of finance from the Scottish Parliament.
In 1993, a review of the workers' education in Scotland resulted in the wind-up of 3 autonomous WEA districts and the creation of a single WEA association in Scotland. At the same time, a constitutional review of the National Association resulted in a change to a single charity status for the WEA. Throughout the 1990s, we in Scotland retained our commitment to social purpose and workers' education. With the innovation and creativity within that context, we saw the development of important projects in community learning and transnational partnerships for workers' education throughout Scotland.
There's a man by my side walking, and there's a voice within me talking, and there's a word needs saying, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. They will tell the lion stories, send their dogs to bite our bodies. They will lock us in their prisons, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. All the lies will be forgotten, and their dogs will lie there rotten. All their prison walls will crumble. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. When you can't go on any longer, hold the hands of your sisters and brothers. Every victory will bring another. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on.